Last week, America watched as the Obama administration effectively fired the head of General Motors. The Los Angeles Times is now reporting Obama takes step over the line that separates government from private industry. President Obama's plan to save the failing U.S. automakers and make them the instruments for creating a cleaner, greener transportation system marked a major step across the line that traditionally separates government from private industry. His automotive task force concluded, for example, that the Chevy Volt, the electric car being developed by General Motors, would be too expensive to survive the marketplace. It declared that GM was still relying too much on high-margin trucks and SUVs, and that Chrysler's best hope was to merge with foreign automaker Fiat. Judgments like these are usually rendered in corporate boardrooms or announced in quarterly reports, but this time they were coming directly from the White House. Forbes.com is now asking, will Obama fire a Wall Street chief? Bloomberg.com is reporting, Baer says FDIC may create a division to shut down non-bank companies. Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation would like to create a division to take over and shut non-bank financial companies as part of the overhaul of U.S. regulations, Chairman Sheila Baer said. Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner suggested the FDIC get power to close failing non-bank institutions when he testified at a House Financial Services Committee hearing on March 26th. Baer said the agency is ready to take on added authority. When government and the private sector merge, that's called fascism. That's what we're dealing with now here in the United States of America. And now the government wants to allow the FDIC to assume control of failing businesses, specifically those that are defined as too big to fail. This is probably the fastest way to destroy free market enterprise. And it's fascism. It's pure fascism. And if the FDIC is granted this extraordinary power, it's only a matter of time before all businesses, small and large alike, will have to be paying into a fund, just as banks do, that the FDIC can then in turn use to seize control of companies and liquidate them.
Monsanto planting seeds in the White House. Apparently, President Obama is considering appointing Michael Taylor to the head of the new Food Safety Working Group. Who's Michael Taylor? Mr. Taylor is a lawyer who began his revolving door adventures as counsel to the FDA. He then moved to King & Spalding, a private sector law firm representing Monsanto, which is a leading agricultural and biotechnology company. In 1991, he returned to the FDA as Deputy Commissioner for Policy, where he was part of the team that issued the agency's decidedly industry-friendly policy on food biotechnology that approved the use of Monsanto's genetically engineered growth hormone in dairy cows. And if you haven't checked that out, Google dairy products or milk and hormone and Monsanto. And there's some information on that that's very interesting. Anyway, continuing, it says, his questionable role in these decisions led to an investigation by the Federal General Accounting Office, which eventually exonerated him of all conflict of interest charges. And I would like to point out, whether or not he was exonerated of the conflict of interest charges, there clearly was a conflict of interest from his back and forth moves from government to corporations. His questionable role in these decisions led to an investigation by the Federal General Accounting Office, which eventually exonerated him of all conflict of interest charges. In 1994, Mr. Taylor moved to the USDA to become an administrator of its Food Safety and Inspection Service. And after another stint in the private legal practice with King & Spalding, Mr. Taylor again joined Monsanto as the Vice President for Public Policy in 1998. This guy was charged with a conflict of interest and cleared of that role, but clearly he had a conflict of interest if he is the one that worked for the company, went to the FDA to approve that company's very questionable practice. Then yeah, there's a conflict of interest no matter which way you crack it. I don't need a court of law to, I don't want to, indict the guy, but come on. But here's the issue. They're going to consider this guy for the Food Safety Working Group, and a guy who was a lawyer for Monsanto and did all these things, the FDA, these very questionable practices. It's like the fox saying, hey, I'll guard the hen house for you because it is precisely from the track record that we have of the Monsanto Corporation, the exact wrong people to be in charge of food safety.
On February 23rd, news agencies all around the world began reporting stories like this one from CNN. Police fear summer of rage over recession. And this article states, we've got G20 coming, and I think that is being advertised on some of the websites as the highlight of what they see as a summer of rage. And now that the 2009 G20 summit is upon us, Reuters is reporting the following. G20 marches begin week of protests in Europe. Tens of thousands of people marched in capital cities across Europe on Saturday to protest about the economic crisis and urge world leaders to act on poverty, jobs, and climate change at the G20 next week. Chanting, "Tax the rich, we'll make them pay," "People before profit," "Make the rich pay," "Capitalism kills," "We will not pay for their crisis," "Hang a banker," "Storm the banks," etc. This is going to be a summer of rage for the working class, said marcher Brian Simpson, 20, a clerk from Glasgow. There has been a total failure of creative finance and of an economy based on the exploitation of workers, financial speculation, and tax evasion, said protester Mario Gianni. I find it eerily suspicious that you have people in the crowd chanting the headlines from 2 months prior, and it should be noted that during a similar protest against the Security and Prosperity Partnership of North America, held in Canada, agent provocateurs were about to start a riot, and they had rocks in their hands, and they were tackled to the ground, and apparently it was noted that they had on the exact same boots as the men restraining them, and after an investigation, they were found to be security officials that felt the need to try to incite a riot. But these quotes that have been given here, they could be coming from any Marxist revolution that's ever occurred in the history of the world. And at a time when our world governments are driving us toward a socialistic one-world government and acting in a hybridized socialist fascist state, giving these bailouts to these corporations and banks and whatnot, it's just ironic that you have people calling for what the world governments are already providing.
Timothy Geithner calls for global regulation. U.S. Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner has pledged to work with his European counterparts on a new framework to govern the global financial sector ahead of next week's crucial G20 summit in London. Mr. Geithner said he was hopeful that the meeting of the leaders from the world's 20 largest companies would produce a roadmap for reform that will stop global banks from shipping risk to lesser regulated domains, as he announced sweeping changes to America's own regulatory system. Our hope is that we can work with Europe on a global framework, a global infrastructure, which has appropriate global oversight, so we don't have a balkanized system at the global level like we had at the national level, he said. Let me just stop right there and say, I don't think that you could have said the word global in any more times in that sentence. This is a man who, whether it was planned or not, has basically had not a lot of help and probably very stressed out. A lot of things have been put on his table as far as getting the economic situation resolved, yet he is essentially being offered this chance to have the world, the global community fix it and just start a new, as he called it, a new infrastructure, new framework. He was looking, as he says, our hope is that we can work with Europe on a global framework, essentially saying, you can have our economy. This is a very big deal. Last week we read a story, Frank, where he was very excited about the proposal of a one-world currency proposed by the Chinese central banker, who he said he had great respect for, and anything that he said was probably a great idea. And this just shows the guy's mindset, that he's willing to essentially hand it over at the very minute that somebody has a better idea. He's going to give our economy over to a global economy under this assumption that somehow that will be safer from risk. But rather, I think that could only mean a much, much easier system to target as far as risk goes.